I remember thinking about it and saying to him, well, keep an eye on it. And I've set out in my statement my initial instincts about it. I don't, to be frank, remember all those conversations, but it's true that we would have spoken on many occasions because we generally spoke quite a lot. I think that in that period, January really to the end of February, towards the end of February, COVID was pretty much like a cloud on the horizon, no bigger than a man's hand, and you didn't know whether it was going to turn into a typhoon or not. And I certainly didn't. I was unsure, and it became clear much later.
The matter was first raised with your Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwill, formally on the 21st of January, which was the date, in fact, of the World Health Organization first novel coronavirus situation report. Do you recall when the matter was first brought officially to your attention? You were obviously aware from news reports, and you'd been aware from your conversations with Mr. Hancock as to the possible crisis or the emergence of this virus in China. But when officially do you recall it was put before you?
I'm sure it's in my in what I've submitted to the inquiry, Mr. Keith. I think certainly there are cabinet discussions in January and in February, and a crescendo of activity about it. But in government, it wasn't yet being escalated to me as something of really truly national concern.
Indeed. A COBRA was convened, chaired by Mr. Hancock, on the 24th of January. And then he chaired a further COBRA meeting on the 29th of January, then the 5th of February, then the 18th of February, and then the 26th of February.
That's right.
It's plain that was quite permissible. COBRA doesn't have to be chaired by a Prime Minister. Yep. Indeed, it can be chaired by an official. But the sheer frequency of those COBRAs, there were then 5 COBRAs within 1 month, all on the same issue of this emerging virus. Didn't the seriousness of the position in late January make itself plain to you? How could there have been a need for a COBRA every week for 5 weeks in relation to an issue that didn't require your direct involvement as the Prime Minister?
I think for the reason you've given, which is that a COBRA is a regular occurrence in government when there's something that a particular government department is leading on. In this case, it was health. The possibility of a coronavirus pandemic, which was only declared by the WHO on the 12th of March, was not something that had yet been, it hadn't really broken upon the political world, certainly in my consciousness, as something of real potential, a real potential national disaster. And in that period, end of January, beginning of February, it's not much in the political world. I wasn't asked about it, for instance, at all at PMQs.
Were you even aware that Mr. Hancock was chairing COBRAs to deal with a new and emerging respiratory virus on those 5 dates?
I think that I was aware that Matt was handling it. I couldn't swear that I was aware that he was handling it in that way on all those particular dates. My instructions to him were to keep me posted, and I would do whatever I could. But by the end of the month, clearly, by the end of February, I'm getting anxious about what we're doing.
We'll come there. Did you or do you recall having any debate with your advisors as to whether or not you should be chairing those COBRAs, or whether or not the seriousness of the position required you to chair the COBRAs at the end of January and throughout February?
Yes, I think there's an exchange. I remember talking to my private office and saying, this is clearly becoming an issue of national
24th of February.
Thank you.
Before that date, for the month beforehand, did you think to say to your officials, the Secretary of State for Health is chairing a COBRA now on a weekly basis to do with a fatal viral pandemic, which currently is just spreading.
It hadn't yet been declared as a pandemic.
It hadn't been declared as a pandemic, but by the 16th of January, it had spread to Thailand and Japan. The scientists in the United Kingdom had reported on the 12% hospitalization rate. It was clear from the material in government that only a small fraction of the infections in Wuhan were being detected, and there was already evidence of limited human-to-human transmission, all by the 16th of January. So, in an overarching sense, why do you think that the Prime Minister, yourself, was not informed earlier as to those extremely worrying features of this emerging virus?
I think that here's what I really think happened. I think that actually everybody, had they stopped to think about it, could see the implications of the data, the implications of what was happening in the numbers, the percentage of fatalities in China. But I don't think that they necessarily drew the right conclusions in that early phase, and which is no fault of theirs. I think what happened was something that was completely outside people's living memory. What we were dealing with is like a once-in-a-century event. And I just don't think people computed the implications of that data. And it wasn't really escalated. It wasn't escalated to me as an issue of national concern until much later. And as you say, I said, look, I think I've got to chair these COBRAs.
You are the Prime Minister. You're obviously an extremely skilled politician, and you have direct, intimate experience of running government. From the viewpoint of the bereaved and those who are terribly damaged and harmed by this pandemic, how could a government have generally failed to stop and think? The system is there to make you think. The risk assessment processes and civil emergency procedures are there to make sure that you don't have to stop and think. It responds. But on this occasion, generally, and it's not a personal point, generally, failed to stop and think. The system is there to make you think. The risk assessment processes and civil emergency procedures are there to make sure that you don't have to stop and think. It responds. But on this occasion, generally, and it's not a personal point, generally the system did not stop and think and say, this data shows there is a greater problem than we currently understand.
I think I think I've tried in a way to give you the answer to that. I think that what really happened was outside our living experience. We hadn't seen something like this for a century or more. And unfortunately, what we did remember was not helpful, because what the system did remember, was things like SARS and MERS and swine flu and so on, other zoonotic diseases that certainly had an impact in Asia, which is what we were seeing, but ultimately were relatively, if not wholly, benign in the UK. And if I had to guess an answer to your question, Mr. Keith, I would say that was probably the default mindset, and that was basically because of people were operating on the basis of their lived experience.
So a failed mindset.
I think it was a human natural response of people based on what they had themselves seen and observed in their lifetimes.
But from the context, from the prism or from the viewpoint of the efficacy and the competence of the government response, regardless of the psychological issues that may have been preying on the minds of its constituent individual parts, that the government failed to wake up, did it not? It failed to understand the significance of the crisis, and therefore, it must follow, failed to take steps speedily enough.
I think that it would certainly be fair to say of me, the entire Whitehall establishment, scientific community included, our advisors included, that we underestimated the scale and the pace of the challenge. And you can see that very clearly in those early days in March, from late February through to the sequence of NPIs, of lockdowns. You can see that we were all collectively underestimating how fast it had already spread in the UK. We underestimated. We put the peak too late. The first peak too late. We thought it would be in May, June. That was totally wrong. I don't blame the scientists for that at all. But that was the feeling, and it just turned out to be wrong.
But the evidence before Milady shows that the scientists, at least in part, were aware by the end of January of the hospitalisation rate, of the fact that the number of infections was being grossly underestimated, that there was self-sustaining human-to-human transmission. They were aware by the beginning of February that there was no effective test, trace, control, isolate system in the United Kingdom. So once the virus spread beyond China and became self-sustaining, there was no effective means of stopping its entry into the United Kingdom. That was all known to the scientists, at least by the beginning of February. Why wasn't it known to the
on the test, trace,
ministers?
On the test, trace and isolate, on the whole diagnostics question, I think if you look at the evidence, you can see actually that we were being assured, I was being assured that we were in a good place on that until it became clear that wasn't quite right.
But I'm asking about the system. Forgive me. I'm asking about the system. If the scientists knew and had the data from which the government could draw the proper conclusions, why didn't the government systemically rise up in light of these alarm bells and do something?
Well, I don't wish to say that we were oblivious, because we weren't. And actually, a lot of work went on, a lot of planning, a huge amount of discussion. So I think, I'm talking quite a lot now. So I think the CMO first briefed me about it on about the 4th of February, and we talk about what could happen. SAGE, as you say, is meeting. It's not as though nothing is happening.
No,
I think that what is going wrong possibly is that we are just underestimating the pace, the contagiousness of the disease, and you can see very clearly from that crucial moment of transition from the 12th to the 13th of March, how radically the scientific appreciation of the situation changed. SAGE on one day was...
Forgive me, Mr. Johnson. I'm asking about January and February, where we haven't got to March yet. When did you first become aware that the test and trace system, whilst extremely efficient in practice, could not be extended beyond the first few hundred cases, that it was a system designed for high consequence infectious diseases? It dealt with travellers, it dealt with index cases, but it couldn't really be expanded beyond 10 or 20 index cases and 500 or 600 contacts.
Yes, you're going to have to forgive me, Ms. Gill. I can't remember exactly when it became obvious that test and trace wasn't going to work, but there came a point quite early on when I think Chris or Patrick said, look, test and trace isn't relevant anymore because of the spread of the disease. I couldn't date that.
From which you then, of course, appreciated that if the virus spread outside China and was self-sustaining, and it had already,
yes, I'm sorry, that was probably much later in March.
All right, you think that was later in March?
I think so, but I couldn't swear to it.
There was a box note on the 30th of January, 136734. This is an email from a member of your office, Mr. Johnson, to Post, the private office support team. Grateful if you could include the below in the box tonight. Prime Minister, to be aware, the Chinese government granted the permission for the flight to evacuate British nationals from Wuhan, so we're concerned here with repatriation. If we then go over the page, there's a reference to the WHO expected to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And then also to be aware, the FCO is drawing down non-official staff across the network in China. The day before, on the 29th of January, there was a COBRA 56226. You weren't, of course, at that COBRA, Mr. Johnson. You've explained how you didn't chair a COBRA until March. If we look at page 5, we will see that the chair, Mr. Hancock, hears from the CMO and Public Health England about the fatalities in China. There was evidence of human-to-human transmission, and Germany had 4 confirmed cases. And then at paragraph 3, the CMO said the UK planning assumption were based on the reasonable worst-case scenario. There were 2 scenarios to be considered. The first was that the spread was confined within China. The second was that the spread was not limited to China, and there would be a pandemic-like scenario with the UK impacted. The second scenario was plausible, but it may take weeks to months. The CMO sets out there in COBRA, and my lady's heard evidence on this, that it was understood that if the second scenario came to pass, there would be a pandemic, because once control had been lost, a viral wave was inevitable.
Yes.
This is a COBRA that takes place on that day. Why were you, the Prime Minister, not being told directly this is a virus which, if it escapes China, will result in a pandemic? There is information already that it has a very serious fatality rate and a very serious hospitalization rate. Why was that basic light bulb information not brought to your attention so that you could see the true nature of this emerging crisis?
I think that I can't give you the exact reason why that COBRA was not brought to my attention. That detail of the COBRA was not brought to my attention. But I can say that at that stage, I think that even the concept of a pandemic did not necessarily imply to the Whitehall mind the kind of utter disaster that COVID was to become. And if I may, and that may sound odd, but what I'm trying to say is that I think people were still operating they were still thinking about things like a flu, an influenza pandemic, or some of the other diseases that I've mentioned.
Well, this material, along with a plethora of other documents, shows that the reasonable worst-case scenario was already being envisaged, and that was a reasonable worst-case scenario which denoted deaths to the tune of 800,000 people. So it couldn't have been unknown to Whitehall, but you say the eventuality was not aware.
I didn't see that figure, and I saw a different figure, I think, towards the end of February, by which time our alarm was really truly raised. But I'm trying to give you my best explanation for why people were in the mindset that they were in.
There was a cabinet on the 31st of January, 56125. If we go to page 10, please, we can see the nature of the debate. It was, of course, chaired by you that afternoon. And the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Mr. Hancock, says 2 cases have been confirmed in the United Kingdom. They had been, of course, confirmed on the 30th and the 31st of January. It was a very serious problem in China, a large number of cases and fatalities. And then the debate moves on to the typical infection rate of 2.5 to 3 people and the mortality rate 2%.
Yes.
So if the reproduction value is 2.5 to 3, that is to say 1 person will infect 2.5 to 3 people in an unimmunized population, and the mortality rate, 2% of people who were infected, or perhaps confirmed cases, it's not clear, means a very, very large number of people will die. Correct?
That's right.
The debate in Cabinet, page 10 and 11, deals with repatriation. The Department for International Development examines developing countries where the risk of spread of the disease was high. Spread of the disease globally would be a big problem for those countries and could also mean further evacuation of British nationals. So the debate focuses almost exclusively around the position abroad, the repatriation issue, and despite the reference to the mortality rate, the reproduction figure, and the knowledge which was already in the possession of government that there was confirmed cases outside China with sustained human-to-human transmission, nobody stopped to say this means inevitably a huge number of deaths, a wall of death, and this country, if it escapes China, being overrun by the virus.
Yes, I think the word inevitably there is the one that I would pick up on, because I think if you look at what the Secretary of State for Health told the Cabinet, he said if the Chinese grip it, then it won't be a problem. But if China don't grip it, then that could be very serious. But your point is still basically a good one, which is that we had to think about what happened if China didn't grip it, and I think we just have to put our hands up here and say, look, I think because of the absence of collective memory, because we were operating under a different set of assumptions, I don't think that we were able to comprehend the implications of what we were actually looking at. And I think that, let me put it a different way. I think if we, as I said right at the beginning, if we had collectively stopped to think about the mathematical implications of some of the forecasts that were being made, and we believed them, we might have operated differently. The problem was that I don't think we attached enough credence to those forecasts, and because of the experience that we'd had with other zoonotic diseases, I think collectively in Whitehall, there was not a sufficient loud enough klaxon of alarm. I don't blame people. I just think it was because of the experience that they'd had all their lives.
The material, Mr. Johnson, shows how at various stages you warned against overreaction. You made the point that SARS and MERS had not turned out to be as serious for the United Kingdom as some had feared at the time. BSE had not resulted in the levels of deaths which some had forecast. So may we take it that you put yourself in that category of people who had insufficient credence?
I was agnostic. I thought I took what Matt had to say very seriously. I thought he wasn't, badgering me without a reason. But on the other hand, I'd had the experience that you describe. So I was waiting for the advice and waiting for that to change.
In your statement, you say, looking back, it is clear, and this is in the context of January, It's clear that we vastly underestimated the risks in those early weeks. If we'd properly understood how fast COVID was spreading and the fact that it was spreading asymptomatically, there are many things we would have done differently. So first, it was nevertheless clear that COVID was spreading because you knew that it had spread outside China to Thailand, South Korea, Japan. And there is material or a growing understanding that it can be transmitted asymptomatically. But what things
there is now?
There was a dawning realization, Mr. Johnson. The material shows, for example, nerve tag on the 14th of February, scientific reports to SAGE in the first week in February, Diamond Princess, and so on and so forth throughout the middle of February. So it was clear it was asymptomatic. But what are the many things that you would have done differently had you, as you say, properly understood the true nature of the crisis?
Well, could I just come back on the asymptomatic
Please.
quickly? Because I do think it's important. The information that I was getting, and I think this went up right till the middle of March, was that you were unlikely to have COVID unless you had the symptoms, and I think I had that from the health secretary.
You did at a cabinet meeting. You were
Right.
told that by
Okay.
the health secretary.
So there seemed to be a great deal of doubt. I'm sure you're right in what you say about the evidence that was knocking around about asymptomatic transmission and infection. I think if we'd known and fully understood, to answer your question, the speed of transmission and the infection fatality rate, case fatality rate, I think clearly we would have acted immediately to accelerate test and trace, we would put huge quantities of time and effort into money into diagnostics, into PPE, into all the things that we were going to need. I'm not saying that work didn't begin. It did begin, but I think the panic level would have been much higher. I'm trying to explain as honestly as I can why I think that panic level wasn't sufficiently high.
Let me make plain the reason I put the question to you in the way that I did in relation to asymptomatic spread is that your own statement says it was not known. If we had properly understood the fact that it was spreading asymptomatically, then there are many things we would have done differently.
Yes, sorry, I should say
you didn't know. You've explained that you didn't know it was spreading asymptomatically, but my suggestion to you is important parts of the government knew by mid-February that it was spreading asymptomatically, and that there was therefore a governmental failure to act on that information in the way that you have very eloquently described.
Well, I can't comment on that because I don't know, what people thought about the issue of asymptomatic transmission in February. I do remember what we were being told. I do remember the view around the cabinet table. I mean, the one thing that has troubled me a lot, I'm sure we'll come on to it, is the March discharge policy, where clearly the question of asymptomatic transmission would have been relevant.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can we come back to that? There's an important contextual position which has to be set out for the purposes of that debate. There is evidence before the inquiry that the chief medical officer told Mr. Hancock at a meeting on the 28th of January that there was credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission within Germany. Was that a fact of which you were aware? Did you know that?
No, that CMO's...
Mr. Hancock had been told there was credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission within Germany at a meeting on the 28th of January.
Well, if I was told that, I've completely forgotten it. My memory of the asymptomatic transmission issue is as I've told you.
Not you, Mr. Hancock was told. That's right, Mr. Johnson. Mr.
No, sorry. I'm sorry. I understand, my lady. What I meant was, if I knew that Chris had told Matt that at some stage, it's completely gone from my mind. What I remember about asymptomatic transmission is that insofar as I paid attention to it, it was that it was not thought to be taking place.
Borders. Your statement states that the advice that you got consistently from the CMO, the government chief scientific advisor in SAGE, was that closing the borders wouldn't work. If you close them dramatically or stringently, then, of course, there are very real, intensely difficult practical consequences. And if you just have screening or light touch restrictions, then they may achieve very little. Will you just explain how you received that advice, in fact, consistently from a COBRA, or the time of a COBRA on the 5th of February, through a cabinet meeting on the 14th of February, and through to the end of February? It was consistent advice that you received.
Yes, thank you. And that is one of the most fascinating things about the scientific advice during this pandemic and the view about behaviours. Many things changed, as I've said. About, masks, other MPIs were thought they moved up and down in the value that people put on them. But when it came to borders, there was an overwhelming scientific consensus, as far as I understood it, that trying to interrupt the virus with tougher border controls bought you really very little. You might delay by a matter of days or perhaps weeks, but you would not stop the virus from entering the UK. And I think that was, I think a lot of people in the country found that very hard to understand, because I think intuitively we think if you just stop this thing coming in. And it was very important for me to try to understand that point and to try to explain it to the public, because the public, I think, really believe instinctively that you can fix this with tough border control, or often do, and it's a difficult point sometimes to get over.
Mr. Cummings says in his statement that you asked rhetorically, aren't people going to think we're mad for not closing the borders?
Well, I may well have said something like that, but I think that I think it was a question that people
were
raised.
asking. He also says, Mr. Johnson, that because of your general attitude that COVID was like swine flu, you weren't particularly inclined to challenge the scientific advice at all, to the effect that border restrictions would make no difference. Is that true?
Well, the two statements seem to me to be inconsistent.
Well, is it true or not?
I certainly thought it was. I thought it was a point worth picking up with the scientists. I wanted to understand the reason why border controls didn't work. But in retrospect, you can see that they were right. Countries that did try to use borders as a way of containing COVID really didn't succeed in that.
So did you pick the point up? You say, I think it was a point worth picking up with the scientists. Did you push back in any way with the scientists and say, can that be right? Is there not anything that can be done to at least restrict the spread of the virus now that it's left China?
I certainly remember many conversations about borders. Quite how adversarial I was, I couldn't tell you.
All right. There was a stock take meeting on the 4th of February, 146558, when, in the context, Mr. Johnson, of a general debate about the DHSC, hence the description stock take meeting, the Chief Medical Officer gave an update. Following an update from the CMO, the Prime Minister stressed the need to continue to explain our stance to maintain public confidence in the plan. On further travel restrictions, your Secretary of State was engaging Foreign Commonwealth Office and European colleagues and would revert with a proposal. According to the Permanent Secretary, Sir Chris Wormold, Mr. Johnson, and to notes kept by Imran Shafi, your Private Secretary of this meeting, you were in listening mode. There was a discussion about possible fatality numbers, but you expressed scepticism about those figures, the fatality numbers, and you noted, they say, that high fatality figures have been given for BSE, bovine spongiform encephalitis, and swine flu. Is that right, that you expressed scepticism about the possible number of deaths?
I don't remember that, but I do remember I certainly remember the BSE scare, and I remember the immense destruction that did to the agricultural sector in this country, and the way that all turned out. I think it would be fair to say that I wanted to probe them on their forecasts and to try to understand the basis on which they were making them.
You've described how the Whitehall system, the process of government in Whitehall, failed to have a light bulb moment and appreciate the seriousness of the position. Would you accept that being informed about the possible fatality numbers but expressing scepticism and drawing a false analogy, as it turned out, with BSE, was a lost opportunity on your part to drive the system further forward with rather more urgency than appears to be the case?
I certainly would accept that my mindset, like the mindset of, I think, the overwhelming majority of the ministers and officials in Whitehall in that period, Jan to mid-Feb, was not as alarmed as we should have been. That's definitely right.
236371, page 37. Mr. Cummings sends a text to what was called a Number 10 Action Group. It's dated the 6th of February, so it's early in February. We know that you were party to this WhatsApp group because your name appears at the bottom, Mr. Johnson. Dominic Cummings, we need a briefing on corona tomorrow. Chief scientist told me today it's probably out of control now and will sweep the world. Will be major comms exercise. Sir Edward Lister then refers to the COBRA meeting, which was clear that China is probably losing it, and once it reaches us, not if it reaches us, once it reaches us, it will not peak for 3 months. Dom is right, the comms is key. And then you say, yes, please, need to talk coronavirus comms at 9. Now, putting aside the issue of whether or not what you said about the mindset of government applied to Mr. Cummings, or the chief scientist who refer there to probably out of control now and will sweep world, why was there a focus, by way of the singular response to that information, on comms? Why didn't any of you say, well, if this virus is probably out of control now and will sweep the world, bearing in mind the fatality numbers, the IFR, the hospitalisation rate, why did none of you say, we need to take steps now to deal with infection control, prevent the spread, alert the population, we have a major problem, not focusing on communications?
Because I think that it's your point about the infection and fatality rate, the consequences. I think that when you read that an Asiatic pandemic is about to sweep the world, you think you've heard it before, and that was the problem. And so I say we need to talk about it, but I think it would be fair to say that the scientific community within Whitehall at that stage was not telling us, that I was not being informed that this was something that was going to require urgent and immediate action.
But you knew,
and I think that although you're right that we could see the mathematical implications of the reasonable worst case scenario, I think the problem was that we didn't think, and this was our mistake, we didn't think that the RWCS was very likely to happen. That was the problem.
We'll come to that.
So when I get told, anyway, forgive me.
But BSE did not have a 2% fatality rate. Swine flu did not have a 2% fatality rate. So when you say there was an institutional failure to realise the seriousness of the position because of prior Asiatic epidemics, or because of BSE or swine flu. The difference was, and it was known to government, was that COVID had a 2% fatality rate, and BSE and swine flu had not.
And that is entirely correct. But I think the tragedy is that we were operating, as I said in my statement, on a fallacious inductive logic about previous reasonable worst case scenarios and this one. And this was the one where I'm afraid the worst predictions turned out to be, or almost the worst predictions turned out to be correct.
56137 is a cabinet meeting on the 6th of February, which you, of course, chaired. On page 6, so that the public can understand, Mr. Johnson, that this document, which is minutes of the whole cabinet meeting, has large parts redacted as being sensitive and irrelevant because, of course, Cabinet dealt with many other issues other than just coronavirus. But on this page, page 6, Cabinet turns to update on coronavirus. It's very serious. Official estimate was around 28,000 cases, but that's likely to be a significant underestimate. The virus didn't appear to have been contained in Wuhan. The mortality rate was only around 2%. There is a reference to a ministerial exercise on this page.
So what date is this cabinet?
This is the 6th of February. There we are. There will be a tabletop exercise the following week. What was your understanding of that tabletop exercise? Did you attend it?
I didn't.
Did you have any role in that?
I didn't attend it, and I'm sure my officials did.
All right. And then just 3 lines above it, the central point to make was that the government had a plan to deal with this illness, and this was guided by science. Did you ask in the course of that cabinet meeting, what, bluntly, is the plan?
I understood the plan to be, from what Matt had said and from the discussions I had had, that we would try to isolate, test, and trace people as they arrived. That was what I thought the plan was, and my impression was that we had a good testing system. But I don't. To answer your question directly, I can't be confident. I said in that meeting, what is the plan? But that is my understanding of what it was.
A week later, on the 14th of February, Mr. Johnson, there's another cabinet meeting and another update, 56138. Page 1, we see the attendees. Page 6, the update on coronavirus. The Prime Minister said the government and the country needed to be ready for the coronavirus situation to get worse. The public messaging so far had struck the right balance between preparing the public for what might happen and not causing unnecessary alarm. Your focus there, Mr. Johnson, appears to be on messaging, on communications, on ensuring that the public are aware, but they're not caused undue alarm by an overreaction. Where was the debate at your urging about infection control measures, the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of stopping the virus from spreading irrevocably throughout the United Kingdom, now it had left China?
Well, I'm not certain that So, first of all, on messaging, the messaging was incredibly important. Messaging, in the end, was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. I don't think we should deprecate the importance of messaging. As for measures to tackle infection, spread of infection within the country, we've talked about borders and we've talked about test and trace. Borders didn't really offer a panacea. Test and trace, we were sadly not as well prepared as we should have been.
So the borders were never going to work. The test and trace couldn't work because it was only for a handful of cases. You've identified no other practical means at the disposal of government to prevent the spread of the virus. Why doesn't somebody say, we have a major problem here? Not only is it coming, but the 2 measures which you've just identified aren't going to work and will never work.
For the reason I've given you, which is that we although we can see the RWCS and we're seeing these numbers, we are not yet believing, perhaps irrationally, but we're not yet believing that the RWCS or anything like it is going to happen. And that's fundamentally the problem.
Page 7, there's another reference to the government's plans. There were plans in place. Top of the page, concluding, the government's chief medical officer said that if the virus became widespread in the United Kingdom, there were plans in place. When the chief medical officer told you that, what did you make of it, bearing in mind that if the virus was widespread, it would necessarily have extended beyond the limited test and trace system about which you were beginning to understand something, and the borders have obviously failed? What were the plans, did you think?
I think that he's referring there to testing and tracing, but plainly that was inadequate. At a certain stage later in the month, as I think I say in my statement, Chris did brief me about NPIs, about lockdowns and other measures.
Indeed. On page 8, you sum up the meeting, Mr. Johnson. You're grateful to the Secretary of State for Health. It was challenging to convince people. Grateful to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care and his department for their work, and particularly for getting the balance of communications right. There was potential for the virus to have a large impact on the UK's economy. Was it because of the mindset to which you have referred the inquiry that you didn't say there is potential for this virus, indeed a probability now that it will kill, rather than focusing on the economy?
Because I didn't say that because you use the word probability in the sense of, I suppose, meaning an overwhelming likelihood. That was not what we thought, or not what I thought, certainly.
All right.
But I did think that we were now in a situation, almost certainly, where we were going to have to take a lot of measures to contain it that would be costly and difficult. So that's the point. And if you think about it, that was my BSc. You're notwithstanding your excellent point that it wasn't nearly as fatal as people had originally said. It costs an awful lot of money.
COBRA on the 18th of February was not a meeting that you were present at, but if we could just have up 56227. In broad outline, Mr. Johnson, and we can see this, I think, from page 7, the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat says to Mr. Hancock, who chaired the meeting, paragraph 7, there was work to be done to create a clear plan of activity. It's not appropriate for me to ask you what was meant by that phrase.
Sorry, this is Matt speaking, is it?
No, that's the if it's paragraph 17 on page 7. The chair invited the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat. This is her responding.
Yeah. This is Catherine Hammond.
Indeed. Were you aware, as Mr. Hancock has acknowledged and has told the inquiry, by this date, the 18th of February, that, quote, there was no rule book. The system had to build many parts of the response from scratch, and that there was no central government plan other than the old 2011 pan-flu strategy. Were you told that?
I was not told that, but that became apparent as the days went on. And clearly, one of the things I hope in this inquiry is that we will have a much better system of planning for these types of events.
146563 is an email chain between your private secretary, Imran Shafi, the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Chris Whitty, and Catherine Hammond concerning the coronavirus in Italy. And to get your chronological bearings, on the 21st of February, so 3 days before, Mr. Johnson, 11 municipalities in Italy, you'll recall, had locked down the population of those municipalities. And also, I should say, that the Diamond Princess affair, that is to say the explosive outbreak of the virus on that cruise ship, had become apparent, as had the figures of the number of people who showed no symptoms on that boat. But to turn to the document itself, your private secretary says it would be good to see where we get to post-Sage tomorrow. At some point soon, I'd like to start exposing the Prime Minister to the potential decisions he might have to take in short order on this. At that moment, it's been fairly abstract with him, I think. Now, plainly, Mr. Johnson, you can't go digging around in other people's emails or in government systems to find out for yourself what's happening. You have to be reliant upon what you're told. What was your general state of information, the general level of knowledge at this date, now in the dog days of February?
Okay, so my memory now is that I think the scenes from Italy really rattled me, and it was. I thought, I remember seeing a note somewhere saying that the fatality rate in Italy was 8%. Because they had an elderly population. I thought, well, my God, we've got an elderly population. This is appalling. And this can't be. And I thought my instinct was this cannot possibly be right. This number. Just so you know, I look at all this stuff in which we seem so oblivious with horror now. I mean, we should have twigged. We should collectively have twigged. Much sooner. I should have twigged. I think what Imran is trying to do here is to get the scientists to take me through the idea of the MPIs and what that would involve.
This is the 24th. There'd been a COBRA on the Tuesday before, the 18th of February. There wasn't a COBRA, in fact, again until the 26th of February. This was just on the cusp of half-term. There was no cabinet between Friday the 14th of February and Tuesday the 25th of February, but SAGE and NervTag continued to convene. Despite being, as you've said it yourself, seriously rattled by the news of Italy, did the tempo of work on coronavirus nevertheless dip during the half-term break that followed?
I noticed that you've been over that period in your previous interrogations in this inquiry, and I hope the inquiry is satisfied that actually there wasn't a long holiday that I took in that.
And you personally, let me ask you,
because I think that there was some misapprehension.
You carried on working. Because you returned to Downing.
For instance, on the 18th.
If you'll allow me to set out the picture, Mr. Johnson, yes. It may make things a bit easier. You returned to Downing Street 3 times, I think, during that half-term break from Chevening, where you weren't at Chequers. You received a number of notes in your red box. You didn't, though, receive a daily update, I think, dealing with coronavirus expressly or exclusively until your return from the half-term break on Monday, the 24th of February. And the question to you is, in the box returns, the box notes that you did receive, what proportion focused on coronavirus?
Well, I can't tell you that. Because I can't remember. But I remember there were certainly conversations going on about COVID with my officials, and in that very period, I rang President Xi of China to offer her the UK's condolences for what was happening in China, to discuss the origins of COVID and to compare notes on what was happening. I also, I think a couple of days later, I rang President Trump in America to discuss exactly the same thing. So it was despite what has previously been said to the inquiry by some of the evidence, there was a lot going on, and it really starts to mount in tempo round about the time that we get Catherine Hammond's note of the
on the 28th of February.
28th, yes.
So the question to you, Mr. Johnson, is this, and nobody is suggesting you put your feet up at Chevening during that week.
Well, apart from you, that is.
Well, what I'm suggesting to you is, by your very own reference to the fact that tempo increased after the half-term break, between the 14th of February, when Cabinet discussed the plans that would need to be drawn up, to the 25th of February, after half-term, relatively little overall was done in terms of responding to this immediate crisis. Was that?
I think that sorry, forgive me, Ms. Keith, forgive me, I was referring to a conversation I happened to catch on the between you and a previous witness, in which I thought the impression was being given by somebody that I was relaxing during that period.
I think it was Mr. Cummings.
It may have been.
And not given by me, Mr. Johnson, but by the witness.
I take it back unreservedly, Ms. Keith, and I apologize. I was working throughout the period, and the tempo did increase, particularly during when we got when I saw the message from Catherine Hammond on, I think it was the 2nd of March, but I'm told it was earlier.
But there was a meeting on the Friday, the 28th of February, that you attended.
That's right. With
the CCS.
That's right. And what troubled me was the sheer number of potential fatalities under the RWCS, and this was just a horrifying figure, and I couldn't believe it. I've got to be honest with you. I thought this because what the paper also said was it may be like a bad flu pandemic, or it may be milder than that. And I thought, well, we have plenty of bad flu pandemics in the UK, and we also have, and if it's milder than that, then it won't be an exceptional thing at all. So why am I also being told that the RWCS is 520,000?
Well, that was, of course, a meeting on the 28th of February. But I want you, please, to answer the question about the tempo of work on coronavirus between the 14th of February and the 28th of February, when that paper was produced to you. Would you accept that there was a lost opportunity on the part of government to react with sufficient speed and attention to the nature of this crisis in that 2-week period? For whatever reason, because of the mindset, because parts of government were away, it matters not. Overall, the government took its eye off the ball in that 2-week period by failing to act sufficiently speedily.
I think that there were clearly things that we could have done if we'd and should have done if we'd known and understood quite how fast it was spreading, but we didn't.
All right.
And that was the reality.
There's a COBRA on Wednesday, the 26th of February, 56216, page 6. This is a crucial moment, although it's not, again, a COBRA that you were present at, Mr. Johnson, but it is a COBRA of the utmost seriousness, because on page 11, the chair, Mr. Hancock, said the reasonable worst-case planning assumptions looked close to becoming the reasonable planning assumptions as cases in Italy demonstrated the need for heightened alertness. Turning that into plain English, what Mr. Hancock was saying was that the government, which had hitherto been working on the basis of planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario, planning for the worst but hoping for a better outcome, had realised that the reality of the scenario identified by Sir Chris Whitty in January, the second scenario, was looking close to becoming the reality. That is to say, the reasonable worst-case scenario was indeed coming to pass. Not there quite yet, but it was looking close. Would you agree that that understanding was a crucial moment?
Sorry, what date is this?
This is the 26th of February. It's a COBRA you weren't present at, and it's in advance of the receipt by you of the civil contingencies paper.
It does look as though that meeting informed Catherine Hammond's, or helped to inform Catherine Hammond's paper and perhaps was the reason why I got had the meeting I did. But I couldn't swear to that.
I haven't asked you that, in fact, but it may well be, as a matter of my lady, the material shows that the CCS were tasked to provide the paper for you before this meeting.
Okay.
But the question from this paragraph for you is, as the Prime Minister, were you told that the COBRA, which you had not shared, had been told that the reasonable worst-case scenario was looking close to becoming the reality?
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
The CCS paper, 28th of February, is 182331. The first paragraph, Ms. Hammond says, COVID-19 looks increasingly likely to become a global pandemic, although this is not yet certain. It's the first sentence of this report. Did you ask Ms. Hammond, how can it not yet be certain when the virus has escaped China, there is sustained human-to-human transmission outside China, there are cases now in the United Kingdom, and we have no means of preventing its spread? Why is she saying it's not yet certain?
I think I don't know the answer why she's saying that. I think, formally speaking, it had not yet been declared a global pandemic, and I think it was up to Tedros Ghebreyesus at the WHO to do so, and maybe she's referring to that. But I read it as meaning it's not yet certain to be a major problem.
Paragraph 2, based on existing assumptions for severe pan flu outbreak, in a reasonable worst-case scenario, about half of the UK's population would become ill, and up to 520,000 people could die as a direct result of COVID-19. Just pausing there, note the reference to could die as opposed to would die once the virus has self-sustaining community transmission. The scientific advice is to use these numbers for planning. They're not a prediction. Did anybody at that meeting, or the meeting in which you had, and we'll come to the actual meeting itself in a moment, but did anybody at the meeting at which this paper was discussed ask Ms. Hammond, why is the sole paper from the Civil Contingency Secretariat, the crisis management body in the heart of government, suggesting that these figures are not a prediction when, as you've just described, the information to COBRA on the 26th of February was saying the reasonable worst-case planning assumption looks close to becoming reality?
I can't answer that question, but it's a very good question.
Page 2, paragraph 9. The report says we need to strike a balance between taking precautionary steps and overreacting. As cases spread, the risk of overreacting is reducing. We're now planning for a potential global pandemic that would inevitably spread to the UK, so it would, in this paragraph, inevitably spread. Did you assess, reading this report, Mr. Johnson, that the reference to overreaction was long past and that, in fact, in the striking of that balance, there was now a real emergency and a need to take precautionary steps straight away?
I think that I found the paper very alarming, arresting. I remember going to talk to my officials about it, saying, which is it? A severe to mild flu pandemic or an RWCS of 520,000? Because I couldn't understand what I was being asked to anticipate.
So I've referred to the meeting. Your private secretary, Imran Shafi, refers at 146636 to the meeting. It's difficult to read his writing, but there is a reference to the PM asking, what's the strategy? There we are. Thank you. Prime Minister, what's the strategy? When are we going to take big decisions? Of what evidence? On what evidence? Of what evidence? and then you say biggest damage done by overreaction. So it looks from the face of this note that your sense that there was a real crisis, that you were extremely rattled, is prevalent in the first sentence. But in the second sentence, perhaps in reflection of the CCS report, you say the biggest damage is done by overreaction.
I think I'm leaving both possibilities open because that's how it still struck me. I think that in disasters such as this, the actions that government take inevitably also have costs, and I'm sure we're going to come on to this, but that's the balance you have to strike.
As the Prime Minister, instead of directing government to respond to the threat of a near existential crisis, you instead warned of the dangers of overreaction.
No, I say no. That's, well, forgive me. I say, when are we going to take some decisions, and on what evidence? Because I'm looking at a problem that's been presented to me. I need to know what the plan is going to be. I've told you that I don't like the look of the way it's going in Italy at all, and we need to do something. And that is the day, I think, the 28th, when I remember, though I'm not sure if Chris would confirm this, I remember having a long conversation with him at some stage around that date, when he takes me through MPI's, what we later refer to as lockdowns, and he tells me about the pros and cons, he gives a sketch of the behavioural fatigue argument, and he takes me through the issues. So I think what I'm saying is, well, if this is the problem, then when am I going to be given a menu of options about what we're going to do about this?
The readout from the meeting 136750 shows that you called for a major ramp up of OGD, other government department activity on domestic preparedness.
And that was the least we could do.
Yes, if you just go over to I think the second page. Oh no, there we are. It's the top of the page. Thank you. I missed it. We need a major ramp up of OGD activity on domestic preparedness. We should use the COBRA meeting to land this point with the Secretaries of State. The Prime Minister agreed with the approach to publish an action plan. That's the plan that was published on the 3rd of March, was it not? Contain delay. He'll review the plan itself over the weekend. You read the draft plan over that weekend, did you not? The 29th and 30th of February.
The first plan, yeah.
28th of February and the 1st of March. And you agreed to the need for early emergency legislation. And then there's a debate about repatriation. Do you, with hindsight, and I emphasise hindsight, Mr. Johnson, accept that the level of seriousness may not have been sufficiently communicated in this direction from you? Do you say you did enough?
I think that I did what I could. I think the problem is that actually, if you exclude borders and test and trace is not as good as it cracked up to be, and if you're told that we've got ample supplies of PPE, I was finding it hard to conceptualise exactly what we should be doing, except for the MPIs, and that was the only thing that I'd been given, and we had no plan for that. And I don't think the concept of lockdown, or even the word lockdown, had yet emerged.
Indeed not. There was a 25th of February SAGE meeting where non-pharmaceutical interventions were debated, but they didn't include lockdown. There was a debate about extreme social distancing in the beginning of March. Lockdown doesn't appear till later.
It doesn't.
But your answer, Mr. Johnson, is I think the problem is that if you exclude borders and test and trace, is not as good as it's cracked out to be. And if you're told we've got ample supplies of PPE, I was finding it hard to conceptualise exactly what we should be doing. That debate, that realisation on your part that there is no effective border control, the PPE may be deficient, that there is no effective test and trace, scaled up test and trace, isolate contact system, is absent from all this material. That debate simply doesn't take place. There is no general realisation the virus is coming. It's a 2% fatality rate or 1% fatality rate, and we haven't got the measures in place to be able to deal with it. That debate doesn't take place.
And I think that's right. And I think it's basically for the same reason that I've given, which is that although people intellectually can see that the RWCS could happen, as Catherine Hammond puts it, they still don't think that it's very likely to happen. And that's the reality.
Now, in March on the 2nd, you chaired your first COBRA. 56217. If we look at page 5, paragraph 2, we can see that you're told that contact tracing for the source of infection for the last 2 cases in the United Kingdom had not been successful. So just pausing there, even the limited test and trace system in the United Kingdom had failed to pick up what was still then only relatively few number of cases. It had not picked up the last 2, and that in both France and Germany there was now sustained community transmission. So in terms of infection spread, it may be thought, game over in terms of infection spread. The aim for the delay phase, if contained failed, was to delay the peak of infections, to reduce the peak and to minimise loss of life. Then in paragraph 3, the CMO said that interventions to delay the spread of the virus must not be implemented too early in order to ensure maximum effectiveness. There is material from SPY B, one of the SAGE subcommittees, on the 4th and 9th of March, also COBRA on the 4th of March and the 9th of March, which demonstrate that the Chief Medical Officer in particular said timing of implementation is crucial. Compliance or despondence is heavily dependent on timing. I'm going to use the well-known phrase behavioural fatigue. Although it has no scientific genesis, you understand the phrase and its meaning. To what extent were your decisions, and we're now getting into the phase of which social distancing measures were starting to be contemplated, to what extent was your decision-making process influenced by this notion that intervention should not be imposed too early?
Well, it was the prevailing view for a long time. And it wasn't just the CMO who articulated the concept of behavioural fatigue. If you look at the many other meetings, or look at the press conference of the 12th of March, you can see that the CSA gives a very full description of what happens if you go in hard and early with a population that has no immunity, and then you release the measures, it bounces back, as I think you've described it, the spring.
Will you forgive me if I pause you there, Mr. Johnson? I was asking you questions about this idea that the population mustn't have measures imposed too early because they will become tired of it.
Yes.
There is an issue about maximum effectiveness. I wasn't, in fact, asking you about the recoiled or uncoiled spring.
Sorry, but the two, forgive me, and you're quite right, but the two things are connected, because what the CSA went on to say on the 12th of March was that people get fed up and that you lose the. So if you have to keep, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, in the matter of the October, November lockdowns, you have to keep doing it. And so my anxiety was, in the absence of therapeutics and without a vaccination program, what would happen if we simply went into a hard lockdown early and then had no alternative but to come out. And so to answer your main question, it was an anxiety, a problem that was very prevalent during those early days.
This issue appears to have been raised with you at a relatively early stage on the 2nd of March. We must not implement too early in order to ensure maximum effectiveness. To what extent do you think it likely that you would have proceeded to implement measures earlier than you did had you not been told you mustn't go too early to ensure maximum effectiveness? What is the impact of this? What should the inquiry make of this debate? Is it important? Did it make a difference?
It's fundamental, and it goes because I'm afraid it's what happened. We have to be realistic about 2020, the whole year, that whole tragic year. We did lock down, but then it bounced back after we'd unlocked. And
so sorry, Mr. Johnson. May I bring you back?
Sorry.
It's the first week in March. Had you not been told, don't go too early, because there's a limit to which the population will be able to bear the implementation of these measures, would you have gone earlier than you did, and by what time were you effectively forced to delay?
I don't think I can't say that I would have gone earlier, because I think I would have been guided by what advice I was getting about when to put MPIs in. Don't forget that this is a once-in-a-century event. We're doing things, we're enacting policy that has never been enacted in our lifetimes in this country. And to do it at the drop of a hat is very logistically difficult, but it was not something you rushed into.
But having been told by the CMO, be careful, don't go too early, because the population might not wear it, did you consider saying to him, well, in this general debate about non-pharmaceutical interventions and social distancing, the public health demands, the likelihood of death and hospitalisation demand that we take these measures, regardless of whether the population are prepared to put up with it over time? Did you push back against this notion of don't go too early?
I thought that the short answer is no. I don't remember. I don't remember saying to myself, absolutely candidly, I don't remember saying to myself, this is so bad, they must be wrong, I must overrule the scientists, or I must ignore the scientists, I must go.
No question of overruling the scientists, so you were following the science.
Correct, forgive me. I must ignore the that's a very important distinction. I must ignore the scientific advice and the threats to public health and of worse outcomes if we go too early, and I must simply maximise. I've got to deal with the problem in front of the windscreen. I've got to deal with it now. I didn't do that, and perhaps with hindsight I should have done. But as I said to you right at the outset of this hearing, I just don't know the answer.
No, that's clear.
Mr. Keith, is that a convenient moment?
But by all means.
It's just that we usually break every hour and a quarter, and I think that's probably enough this morning.
Thank you.
20 to 2, please.
All rise.